Before empires ruled Anatolia, wind and stone shaped its destiny. From these rugged highlands emerged the Phrygians, wanderers who crossed from Thrace to build a kingdom where Hittite glory had crumbled. Their capital at Gordium became the heartbeat of ancient trade, while their artisans crafted wonders in bronze that dazzled the ancient world. Led by kings whose touch seemed golden, they created a civilization of intricate balance until fire swept their cities away. Though conquered by Cimmerians, Lydians, and Persians, their legacy endured in the worship of the mother goddess who outlasted every empire that claimed her land. Across the heart of Anatolia, before any song of Midas was ever sung, there stretched a land of thunder and stone. Winds scoured its high plains, bending the grasses that clung to the ridges. In spring, the valleys filled with water and shimmered like mirrors beneath a hard blue sky. In winter, frost sealed the rivers and turned the hills white. It was a continent in miniature. Mountains like fortresses, plateaus that seemed made for empires. Long before the Phrygians crossed its frontiers, others had already written their own epics into its soil. Far to the north, along the winding Halys River, stood the towns of the Hattians, the first known masters of this interior world. They built with sun-dried clay and worshipped gods whose names are now half forgotten. Their rulers claimed descent from storms, and their priests read omens in the flight of birds. Bronze was their alchemy, fire their servant. In the glow of their furnaces, the first gleam of civilization flickered over Anatolia. Trade moved slowly along river and ridge, tin from the east, copper from the mountains, and the first gold dust that men ever dreamed could rival the sun. From these beginnings rose the Hittites, a people who forged a realm from faith and iron. They called themselves the people of the 1,000 gods, and their king ruled not just as a warrior, but as the appointed heir of the Storm Lord himself. Hattusa, their capital, stood encircled by walls thick enough to defy centuries. Beyond its gates lay a network of cities, farms, and fortresses stretching to the shores of the Black Sea. They spoke in the clipped rhythm of cuneiform tablets, clay pressed with reeds, words that turned breath into permanence. Within those lines of wedges survives the pulse of an empire. Grain counted, soldiers dispatched, treaties sealed by the gods of thunder and oath. The plateau under their dominion was not a silent place. To the west lived the Luwians, traders and sailors, whose language danced across the stones of sanctuaries and boundary markers. To the east, the mountain tribes watched and waited, too proud to bow, but too scattered to rule. In between, on the plains that later generations would call Phrygia, fields of barley and herds of cattle spread across an expanse so broad that even kings measured distance by days of travel. It was a land built for endurance, but not even endurance could defy the weight of time. By the 13th century BC, the Hittite monarchs had grown weary from war and intrigue. Their armies marched south against Egypt, east against the highland tribes, and west against restless vassals. In the shadows of their victories, famine whispered. Crops failed, storms returned with a vengeance. The archives of their capital began to fill with desperate letters, appeals for grain, for loyalty, for mercy. Then came the migrations. From the distant seas to the west, strange ships appeared, their prows carved with the faces of lions and birds of prey. Raiders, settlers, wanderers. The later world would call them the Sea Peoples, and with them came fire. One by one, the strongholds of the Bronze Age fell. Troy burned, Ugarit vanished, and the proud kings of Hattusa fled into legend. When the smoke cleared, nothing of the old order remained. Across the central plateau, palaces lay open to the sky, their tablets scattered like broken bones. The roads that once carried envoys and caravans filled instead with silence. The great city of Hattusa became a ghost, its gates standing like the jaws of a ruined beast. Yet history does not end with catastrophe. It pauses, waiting for someone to listen. The centuries that followed were an age of uncertainty, but also of rebirth. In the quiet fields where once stood Hittite watchtowers, new hearths were lit. Peoples displaced from every corner of the Aegean drifted eastward, bringing their own tongues, tools, and faiths. The memory of the gods changed accents. Their names survived, though pronounced in different songs. Somewhere among these wanderers were the first who would be known as Phrygians. Their trail is faint, glimpsed only in the patterns left behind. A style of weaving, a type of vessel, a melody that did not sound like the old Anatolian chants. They arrived not as conquerors, but as inheritors of a world already fractured. The lands they entered were scarred, but fertile. The walls they found were empty, but waiting. Historical traces hint at the persistence of life amid ruin. Settlements rose where rivers cut the earth deep. Small communities at first, then clusters of towns. Their leaders built new enclosures over ancient stones, shaping a landscape that blended memory and innovation. Old sanctuaries were repurposed. New altars stood beside the fallen idols of vanished gods. In this mingling of eras, the identity of Phrygia began to take form. The transformation of Anatolia during these years was not marked by conquest, but by continuity. The people who tilled the soil or led flocks across the plains did not see themselves as witnesses to a new age. They lived by rhythms older than kings. The turning of seasons, the rise and fall of the rivers, the harvest before the frost. Yet their world was changing. A new language, kin to those of the western lands, began to echo among the hills. Timber replaced stone in their fortresses. Circular dwellings gave way to halls, supported by great wooden beams. Above them loomed the mountains that had once divided nations. Now they stood merely as boundaries of wind and cloud. Through the long centuries of this twilight age, Anatolia remained a crossroads of memory. Travelers still followed the ancient trade routes, though the empires they once served were gone. Some carried amber from the northern seas, others brought spices or fine wool. They spoke of faraway wars, of cities reborn under new names. But in the heart of the plateau, the stories turned inward. In these stories, the Phrygians were already taking shape. Farmers who learned to carve their symbols into rock. Herders who sang to the mountains they believed alive. The ruins of Hittite strongholds became their fortresses. The forgotten gods of the land became their own. Their culture would not spring from nothing, but from the soil enriched by centuries of loss and renewal. As generations passed, their settlements grew. Wooden houses became towns, and towns grew into small centers bound by trade and kinship. In the valleys, the first tumuli rose, earthen mounds beneath which the honored dead were laid to rest. These were not mere graves. They were statements of belonging, the claim of a people who intended to remain. Around them, fields ripened in the sun, and roads once again carried merchants and messages between the scattered communities of the interior. The old powers of the east, Assyria, Babylon, had turned their gaze elsewhere, leaving Anatolia to mend itself in solitude. And so it did. From ruin, a quiet order returned. The past was neither forgotten nor imitated. It was absorbed, its lessons whispered rather than written. By the close of this age, the Anatolian plateau was no longer the realm of the Hittite kings, nor the desolation left by their fall. It had become something in between, a tapestry woven of remnants and beginnings. Villages dotted the plains, their smoke curling above the hills where once stood fortresses of empire. The people who lived there would one day be called Phrygians, though they did not yet know it. They had no single ruler, no capital, no legend to unite them, but they shared the resilience of a land that refused to yield. Out of this endurance, a new civilization would rise, one that remembered the thunder of the Hittite storm god, the songs of the Lydians, and the wandering spirit of those who came from the west. In time, they would build cities again and write their names on stone. They would craft stories of kings whose touch turned to gold, of knots that bound destiny itself. But for now, in the stillness after the fall, the stage was set. The winds moved across the plains, carrying whispers of what was to come. The dawn before the Phrygians. When the Bronze Age ended, the world of the Aegean and Anatolia seemed to dissolve into motion. Kingdoms once thought eternal fell in a single generation. Across the seas, palaces that had glittered for centuries lay in ash, and the roads that had bound east and west became trails of exile. Out of this chaos came wanderers, tribes driven by hunger, ambition, or divine command, moving like rivers across the wreckage of empire. Among them were the people who would be called Phrygians. Their story began, it is said, beyond the Hellespont, in the rugged lands of Thrace and Macedonia. There, under the name Phrygians, they lived between mountain and shore, neighbors to the tribes who sang of heroes and gods. They were herders and smiths, warriors who fought not for empire, but for endurance. The fall of the Mycenaean world to the west and the collapse of the Hittite order to the east opened a vast corridor of opportunity and peril. The seas were no longer safe, but the land beckoned. Bands of families packed their carts, yoked their oxen, and turned toward the rising sun. They carried their household gods in wooden boxes, their songs in memory, and their sense of belonging in the rhythm of their steps. To cross from Europe into Asia was to cross more than a strait. It was to abandon certainty. The winds of the Propontis howled as they ferried their possessions across, the waters foaming against the hulls of simple boats. What waited beyond was an empty land scarred by forgotten wars, but also rich in promise. They moved south along the coast, then inland, following the valleys of the rivers that cut through the plateau. Their path led them into a landscape of vast loneliness, plains where broken stones marked the outlines of older civilizations. The silence was deceptive. Beneath the soil, history slept. Beneath their feet, the ashes of the Hittites still held the memory of empire. Historical traces suggest that the newcomers did not arrive as conquerors sweeping the land, but as settlers drawn to abandoned fields. They built timber houses over buried foundations, raised fences where walls had crumbled, and lit fires in hearths long cold. From their tools and ornaments, one senses both continuity and difference. The echo of the West mingled with the persistence of the old Anatolian ways. Their pottery, once plain and practical, began to adopt new forms, shapes more angular, patterns more deliberate. Clay vessels bore marks not seen before in central Anatolia, suggesting hands trained in another tradition. The dead, too, were treated differently. Instead of the stone tombs of the Hittites, these wanderers laid their ancestors beneath mounds of earth, wrapped with care, surrounded by offerings for the journey beyond. Each burial became a declaration. We belong here now. Through these quiet acts, the landscape began to change. Villages rose beside rivers and across low ridges, each bound by kinship and shared labor. They cleared the overgrown roads that once carried imperial caravans and reopened paths toward the western coast. Herds grazed on slopes once patrolled by soldiers. What had been a frontier of ruin was now a network of renewal. Among the settlers, leadership emerged not through inheritance, but through merit. Those who could organize, negotiate, defend. A chieftain's hall was less a palace than a meeting place, a center where disputes were settled and alliances forged. The wisdom of elders replaced the decrees of kings. Survival demanded cooperation more than command. Over time, these communities began to coalesce into something larger, a cultural current flowing across the plains. Language followed this blending. The speech of the migrants, kin to the tongues of Thrace and Illyria, absorbed the rhythms of Anatolia. Old words for wind, river, and stone took on new meanings. By the time their descendants carved letters into rock, the sound of their language would be unmistakable, distinct from the vanished voices around them, yet carrying faint echoes of both east and west. As these western settlers spread deeper into the interior, they encountered remnants of the Hittite world still clinging to existence. Small enclaves ruled by local princes, villages that still honored the old gods of storm and sun. Rather than destroy them, the newcomers absorbed their traditions. The gods changed names, but not nature. The rites persisted, altered just enough to fit new tongues. In this exchange lay the foundation of what would become Phrygian identity. A fusion, not a replacement. Far to the south, the kingdoms of Syria and Mesopotamia were rebuilding under new dynasties. Messengers from those lands began to hear rumors of activity in the central plateau, of a people restoring fields and towns where silence had reigned. They did not yet call them Phrygians. They called them the people of the north, or simply those beyond the Hales. But their presence was felt. Caravans resumed their passage through the interior, bringing metals, cloth, and stories. The migrants were not without struggle. Winter on the plateau was merciless. Crops failed, and famine stalked the valleys. Wolves came down from the hills. But endurance had long been their craft. When a village burned, they rebuilt. When a leader fell, another rose. They measured time not by years, but by the passing of storms and the births of children. Their songs told of rivers crossed and loved ones lost. The human record of migration made memory. Over generations, their settlements stretched across the Sangarius basin. That river, broad and winding, became the lifeline of their world, the artery through which trade and tale flowed. Along its banks, they built larger halls, granaries, and sanctuaries. The people who once wandered without homeland now found themselves shaping one. The forests around them thinned as they cut timber for construction. Fields expanded, and with them came the confidence of permanence. At times, they clashed with neighboring tribes, Lydian farmers to the south, or highland clans from the east. But the conflicts rarely grew into wars of annihilation. The plateau was wide, and there was room enough for many to survive. Where borders were drawn, they were marked not by walls, but by mounds and rivers. The centuries blurred, and the newcomers became natives. Their children no longer remembered the long journey from the west. Their myths placed their origins among the mountains and plains where they now lived. Yet something of their earlier restlessness endured. A sense that the world was still shifting, that greatness could be built from ruins. By the end of the 12th century, BC, the migration had slowed. The tribes once scattered along the western hills had settled into the heart of Anatolia, forming a patchwork of communities linked by trade and shared tongue. The memory of the old Hittite Empire was fading into legend, and the newcomers filled that void with their own stories. They spoke of ancestral heroes who tamed the rivers, of leaders who dreamed of unity. One of these leaders, his name lost to time, is said to have led his people to a fertile plain along the Sakarya River. There, the soil was rich and the horizon wide. He declared that this would be their home, and his followers built a settlement that grew stronger with each passing season. From this seed would rise the city of Gordium, and with it, the heart of Phrygia. As the fires of their hearths burned through the long winters, a new culture gathered its strength. The migrants had ceased to wander. They were now cultivators, builders, and storytellers. Their gods had new names, their songs new verses, but their spirit remained the same, forged in movement, tempered in survival. The plateau, once empty, now pulsed with life again. Overhead, the constellations that had guided them from the west seemed fixed once more. What began as flight had become foundation. The people who had crossed the straits as strangers now gazed upon the land and saw themselves reflected in it, resilient, enduring, and destined to leave their mark. The age of wandering was ending. The age of Phrygia was about to begin, where two rivers meet, one swift, the other slow. The land folds into a valley wide enough for a city. There, amid poplar groves and whispering reeds, the Phrygians chose to root their destiny. The place would one day be called Gordium. Its hills looked east toward the rising sun and west toward the lands their ancestors had crossed. It was a meeting point, not only of waters, but of worlds, old and new, native and migrant, memory and ambition. In the early years, Gordium was no more than a gathering of huts on raised ground, surrounded by fields where barley and emmer swayed in the wind. Smoke curled from hearths, and the smell of wet clay mixed with that of roasted grain. Yet even then, there was intent in its layout, straight paths between dwellings, storehouses set apart, a communal hall larger than any other structure. Those who built it were no longer wanderers. They were planners, shaping permanence out of earth and timber. From the beginning, the settlement served as a center of exchange. Caravans from the west brought fine cloth, copper, and horses. Travelers from the east carried oil, spices, and tales of distant kings. The Sangarius River served as their messenger, linking Gordium to every direction at once. Through these channels flowed not only goods, but ideas. A sense of order began to take hold, one that sought unity beyond tribe or clan. Leadership evolved with the settlement. At first, elders decided matters by council, seated around the hearth in the great hall. But as trade grew and disputes multiplied, they chose a single figure to speak for all. His name is lost, though the title he bore would echo through Phrygian legend. King, not by divine right, but by consent and reverence. He ruled less as conqueror than as arbiter, guiding a people newly bound to their land. From that authority, the earliest form of Phrygian kingship took root. The city expanded outward in concentric rings. The innermost housed the royal compound, a cluster of halls supported by massive beams of cedar and pine, their walls lined with painted clay. Beyond it spread the craftsman's quarter, where furnaces glowed red into the night. The air smelled of metal and smoke, a promise of the skills that would later define Phrygian fame. Surrounding it all were defensive ramparts of packed earth faced with timber, sturdy practical and steeped in the memory of older fortifications now vanished. Over time, Gordium's growth reshaped its people. Farmers became merchants. Herders turned soldiers. The need to defend trade routes and storehouses led to the creation of a standing guard, men who swore loyalty not to family but to the city itself. When neighboring clans came seeking alliance or refuge, Gordium offered both in exchange for fealty. Through such pacts, Phrygian unity began to take form. Historical traces hint at a transformation, visible even in the smallest details of daily life. Pottery, once simple, now bore intricate geometric patterns, interlocking lines and spirals that seemed to suggest motion, even in stillness. Textiles grew more elaborate, dyed with plant colors and adorned with symbols whose meanings would fade with time. The Phrygians were beginning to speak not only through word, but through art, a visual language of identity that tied them to their home. The burial mounds that dotted the horizon tell the same story in silent grandeur. Each was raised for a chieftain or noble, its core packed with stone and clay, its heart filled with offerings, vessels of food and drink, ornaments of bronze and gold, carved furniture whose designs mirrored the world above. These tumuli were not simply tombs. They were monuments of belonging, declarations of lineage that reached beyond the grave. Every mound proclaimed the same truth. The Phrygians had become a people of the land, not merely its tenants. From this flourishing came the stirrings of belief, a sense that the earth itself was alive, that beneath the hills dwelled forces of fertility and protection. The early Phrygian gods bore familiar echoes of the Anatolian pantheon, yet were reshaped by the people who invoked them. Chief among them was a mother figure, not yet called by the names she would later bear, but already revered as the source of growth and renewal. Her altars stood near springs and beneath trees. Her image was carved into rock faces overlooking the fields. She was both origin and continuity, the divine counterpart of the new nation's persistence. As Gordium prospered, it also began to look outward. The surrounding plains, once scattered with villages, were drawn into its orbit. Messengers rode between settlements carrying tokens of alliance, carved staffs, woven sashes, or fragments of dyed cloth as symbols of shared purpose. What had been a network of kin groups slowly crystallized into a realm. Its borders were less lines than relationships, defined by loyalty, trade, and the promise of mutual defense. The city's artisans, meanwhile, transformed local resources into marvels. Timber from the northern forests became beams and furniture. Ores from nearby hills were smelted into weapons, tools, and ornaments. The skill of their metalworkers became renowned across the plateau. Visitors described their cauldrons and fibulae as works of both function and beauty, objects that combined practical mastery with sacred meaning. Even their simplest tools bore decoration, as if craftsmanship itself were a form of worship. Language, too, was taking shape. Inscriptions carved on stone or wood reveal the first expressions of Phrygian writing, letters born of foreign influence, yet molded to their own sound. The act of inscribing became almost sacred, a way of ensuring that words endured as solidly as walls. Through writing, memory ceased to depend solely on song. The spoken and the carved began to mirror each other, each reinforcing the other's permanence. By the middle of the 10th century BC, Gordium had grown into a true city, organized, fortified, and aware of its own stature. Its markets drew traders from the Black Sea coast and the southern plains. Its leaders sent emissaries to neighboring regions, not as supplicants, but as equals. The once isolated tribes of the plateau now looked to Gordium for guidance and protection. In this consolidation lay the birth of the Phrygian kingdom. Though its boundaries were still fluid, its heart was unmistakable. From Gordium radiated a sense of cohesion, a belief that they shared not just ancestry, but destiny. The city became more than a capital. It was a symbol, a statement carved into the land that this people intended to endure. Legends would later claim that a humble cart once stood in Gordium's central court, bound by a knot so complex that it defied all who sought to untie it. Some said it was the very cart that carried the first Phrygian king to his throne. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential. The idea that the Phrygians saw fate as a challenge to be mastered by ingenuity rather than strength. As the first generation of Gordium's founders passed into memory, their children inherited a city already humming with purpose. They learned to balance reverence for the past with hunger for progress. In their festivals, songs of migration mingled with hymns of prosperity. The land that had once been a refuge now demanded stewardship. Beyond the plains, whispers of new powers rising in the east began to reach them. To the north, restless tribes tested their borders. Yet Gordium stood firm, protected by both its walls and its reputation. Visitors would later recall the sight of its tumuli glowing under the setting sun, each like a small mountain, marking the triumph of endurance over time. Thus the Phrygians entered history, no longer wanderers seeking home, but builders of one. In the union of earth and will, of memory and invention, they forged a kingdom that would endure for centuries. Their story had passed from legend into permanence, anchored by a city whose name would echo long after its stones had fallen. Morning mist drifted across the plains around Gordium, softening the outlines of its ramparts. Within those walls, smoke curled from 100 hearths, rising into a pale sky streaked with red. It was the dawn of a new age, the time when a settlement became a capital and a people discovered what it meant to rule. The Phrygians had bound their fate to the land. Now they would bind it to a crown. The kings who emerged from Gordium's halls were not tyrants in the mold of the old Hittite lords. They were stewards first, men chosen for their judgment, their ability to mediate between the needs of trade and the demands of faith. In their speech, power and piety walked hand in hand. Their authority rested not on conquest, but on cohesion, a pact between ruler and ruled that wove together clan, city, and countryside into one fabric. Yet even harmony breeds ambition. From the simple throne of Gordium, the first true Phrygian monarchs began to imagine dominion over all the plateau. The kingdom expanded through persuasion more than war. Envoys rode across valleys, bearing carved staffs as tokens of alliance. Neighboring communities, drawn by Gordium's markets and stability, pledged their loyalty. In return, they gained access to trade routes, security, and the prestige of belonging to a realm whose wealth and artistry were beginning to astonish its neighbors. Trade became the lifeblood of this new monarchy. Caravans from the Black Sea brought amber and horses. Merchants from the Aegean carried fine pottery and ideas from far-off islands. To the east, goods flowed from Assyria and Urartu, metals, spices, and woven fabrics. Gordium stood at the crossroads of these currents, a city whose gates opened to every horizon. Its treasuries filled, and with wealth came refinement. The court of Gordium grew into a spectacle of craft and ceremony. Nobles wore garments dyed in vivid hues, clasped with fibulae shaped like birds and beasts. Musicians played lyres carved from mountain wood, their melodies echoing across courtyards paved with patterned clay. In the workshops below the citadel, artisans labored beside glowing furnaces, perfecting the art of casting bronze. Their cauldrons, embossed with geometric designs and images of lions or griffins, would one day be prized as wonders across the ancient world. Through such artistry, the Phrygians proclaimed their vision of order. Their style was unmistakable, disciplined yet alive, intricate yet balanced. Every motif carried meaning: spirals for eternity, meanders for continuity, and stylized wings for the freedom of spirit that defined their people. Even in their ornament, they revealed a belief that beauty was a form of strength. The rise of Gordium brought with it the rise of writing. Inscriptions carved into stone and rock-cut facades appeared across the realm, statements of faith, law, and lineage. The script was their own, born from foreign influence, but reshaped to suit their language. On the cliffs at Midas city, near the sacred mountain, great panels bore dedications to the gods, the letters cut deep as if meant to last forever. These were not mere records, they were declarations that the Phrygian voice had joined the chorus of history. Kingship in Phrygia fused the mortal and divine. The ruler was seen as the intermediary between the people and the powers that governed the earth. Ceremonies marked the cycle of seasons, spring processions where offerings were placed at mountain shrines, autumn feasts celebrating harvest and renewal. At the heart of these rites stood the Great Mother, the goddess of fertility and transformation, whose presence sanctified both throne and field. The king, as her chosen servant, embodied the prosperity of the land. When the rains failed, his prayers filled the air. When the crops flourished, his praise was sung through every village. Beyond Gordium, the kingdom's reach extended into the highlands. Small citadels and trading outposts rose along key routes, each governed by loyal nobles whose fortunes depended on royal favor. These strongholds mirrored the capital, their gates adorned with carved lions, their halls decorated with scenes of banquets and hunts. The countryside around them grew rich, feeding the cities with grain, wool, and metal. Phrygia's heartland was now a network of thriving communities, bound by shared language and belief. Yet prosperity rarely goes unnoticed. To the east, the kings of Urartu fortified their borders. To the south, Assyrian scribes recorded rumors of a rising power on the plateau. Even Lydia, the western neighbor, still in its infancy, watched with wary admiration. The Phrygians did not seek war, but neither did they fear it. Their warriors, armed with bronze-tipped spears and shields of layered hide, stood ready to defend the trade routes that sustained their realm. Inside the citadel, the monarch presided over councils where matters of law and tribute were debated. Though the king's word was final, his wisdom was measured by restraint. To rule justly meant maintaining balance between wealth and humility, faith and ambition, peace and vigilance. It was a fragile equilibrium, but one the Phrygians managed with remarkable grace. Historical traces speak of monumental constructions during this period, massive fortifications and palatial complexes raised in Gordium's center. Timber beams the width of a man's height supported roofs of baked clay. Courtyards enclosed gardens where fountains murmured over stone basins. Within the walls, artisans worked under the patronage of nobles, creating objects meant to honor gods and glorify kings. Even the burial mounds grew larger and more elaborate, reflecting both devotion and status. In this atmosphere of wealth and confidence, stories began to take root. Tales of rulers whose wisdom rivaled their power, of men touched by the gods. One such tale would later name a peasant king who arrived in Gordium with an ox cart and was crowned by prophecy. Whether legend or distant memory, it captured the Phrygian belief that destiny favored the humble who served with piety. The Phrygian monarchy also developed a complex administration. Scribes kept records of tribute and harvests, ensuring the steady flow of goods through the kingdom's heart. Messengers traveled between provinces with carved seals bearing the royal emblem, a stylized sun framed by wings, symbol of protection and enlightenment. Justice, once tribal, became centralized. Disputes were brought before magistrates who ruled in the king's name, guided by both tradition and sacred oath. Still, even as the system matured, Gordium remained less an empire than a living organism. Its strength lay not in domination, but in cohesion. The Phrygians understood that survival on the Anatolian plateau demanded flexibility, the capacity to absorb change without losing essence. Their kings embodied this principle, both guardians of order and instruments of adaptation. As the 9th century turned toward the 8th, Phrygia had become one of the defining powers of Anatolia. Its influence reached from the western highlands to the edge of Assyria's orbit. Merchants carried its goods as far as the Aegean. Its art inspired imitation among neighbors. Inscriptions carved into stone spoke of rulers confident in their purpose, invoking both the gods and their ancestors as witnesses to their deeds. But success brings its own shadows. Whispers of pride and extravagance began to surface. Nobles who grew fat on tribute, artisans who sought glory over devotion, merchants whose greed outpaced their loyalty. For the moment, the kingdom stood unshaken, its unity intact. Yet beneath the surface, the first fissures of human ambition had begun to appear. The Age of Kings closed as it had begun, with Gordium's towers gleaming in the sun and its fields rich with harvest. The Phrygians had achieved what few before them had managed. They turned a land once fractured by ruin into a realm bound by purpose. But the rhythm of history is never still. Beyond the horizon, new forces stirred. Armies, legends, and the whisper of a name that would soon define Phrygia for all time. Midas. By the early 8th century, BC, Phrygia had reached a rare balance between wealth and faith. Gordium's streets thrummed with the sound of metal and trade. Its ramparts glowed red in the dusk. From this wellspring of abundance rose a monarch whose name would echo from Assyria to Greece, Midas, the Golden King, heir to both legend and burden. He was remembered as the son of Gordius, the farmer who once rode into the city on an ox cart and was crowned by prophecy. Whether born of humble blood or royal line, Midas inherited a kingdom at the height of its confidence. In his reign, artistry became power and prosperity, a kind of worship. To rule was to refine. Under his direction, Gordium blossomed into the radiant heart of Anatolia. Merchants arrived from every quarter, from Lydia with dyes and silver, from the Aegean with fine pottery, from the east with lapis, ivory, and spice. The city's workshops shone like small constellations, their furnaces never dark. Artisans cast cauldrons of extraordinary craftsmanship, hammered bronze until it gleamed like amber, and clasped noble cloaks with intricate fibulae that seemed alive in motion. Phrygian art reached its golden symmetry under his gaze. At court, feasts lasted for days. Music drifted through cedar halls, and poets recited verses comparing Midas to the gods. The monarch listened, grave and content, knowing that stories could outlast armies. He understood that the spoken word was a kingdom's truest treasury. Beneath the pageantry, however, he ruled with discipline, a man convinced that prosperity must be both earned and consecrated. Each spring, during the rites of renewal, Midas walked barefoot into the fields, pouring wine upon the earth in honor of the Great Mother. Her cult, older than any throne, bound the people together. The mother was both soil and destiny, and the king her chosen steward. When the rains failed, he prayed in her temples. When they returned, he credited her mercy. In this devotion lay the source of his authority. To the world beyond Phrygia, Midas became a figure of fascination. The Assyrians called him Meter of Mushki, a powerful ally and occasional adversary. Their scribes described a ruler skilled in negotiation, a man who could balance diplomacy with defiance. To the Greeks across the sea, whose sailors traded in his ports, he was a living legend. They transformed rumor into fable, a tale of a man whose touch turned everything to gold. The story was exaggeration, but it captured an undeniable truth. Under Midas, everything indeed flourished, and perhaps too much. Historical traces tell of Gordium's transformation in this era. The city's walls were strengthened, its citadel rebuilt with massive beams of pine and cedar. The new palace, rising above the river plain, symbolized both piety and pride. Murals lined its halls with scenes of banquets, hunts, and divine visions. Beyond the city, vast mounds began to rise, earthen pyramids sealing the memory of nobles who had grown nearly as grand as kings. The greatest of them all, raised later, would be said to guard Midas himself. His reign was a performance of balance. With one hand, he extended gifts to Assyria. With the other, he courted Lydia and the Aegean states. Tribute passed both ways, gold for peace, grain for alliance, song for goodwill. In his dealings, he proved that wit could guard a frontier better than spears. For a time, Phrygia thrived between empires, neither conquered nor conqueror, secure in its wealth and self-belief. Even so, success has its shadows. Within the court, noble families competed for the king's favor. Merchants grew bolder, their fortunes rivaling those of ancient houses. The splendor that once symbolized unity began to fray into vanity. Even the temples gleamed too brightly, as if the gods themselves might grow restless under so much praise. Midas, ever mindful of omens, increased his offerings to the mother and to the lesser deities who guarded field and flame. He knew how swiftly divine favor could turn. Later ages embroidered his name with parable. Greek storytellers claimed that Midas, granted a wish by Dionysus, asked for the power to turn all he touched to gold, only to find himself cursed by abundance. Unable to eat, drink, or embrace his child, he prayed for deliverance and bathed in a sacred river that carried away his gift. The myth was invention, but it understood his world. A ruler whose glory risked devouring itself. Amid this brilliance, his people worked and worshipped as though time had stopped. The artisans continued to craft wonders. Wooden furniture inlaid with bronze, patterned fabrics of astonishing geometry, vessels so fine they seemed meant for the gods. In every creation shimmered the belief that art could make memory eternal. Midas encouraged it all, certain that beauty was a form of prayer. Still, the plateau does not remain silent forever. Beyond its edges, Assyrian power surged again, and whispers of steppe riders reached the frontier. The Golden King could not hear them yet. His realm still hummed with prosperity, his name carried in reverence. But the wind that passed over Gordium's tumuli already held a scent of smoke. Before that reckoning, Midas reigned at the height of his myth. In him, faith and ambition fused. A sovereign who embodied both the promise and peril of his age. To his people, he was a living symbol, the one who had turned endurance into greatness. To later generations, he became more than human, the eternal measure of wealth and its curse. And as the sun set on Phrygia's golden age, the king of Gordium stood upon his palace terrace, gazing over fields that gleamed in the fading light. Perhaps he believed the glow would last forever. Perhaps he already knew it would not. Prosperity had become a habit in Phrygia. From the citadel of Gordium, the sovereign looked out over a kingdom so orderly that even the seasons seemed to obey. Fields shimmered with barley. Vineyards climbed the hillsides, and caravans crossed the plains in an unbroken procession of color and noise. To travelers from distant lands, this was no longer a frontier. It was a marvel of discipline and grace, a nation built on patience, craft, and faith. At dawn, the city stirred to a rhythm as practiced as ritual. Bronze gates opened to the sound of flutes, and herds moved through the streets toward the river crossings. Merchants called out prices in a dozen tongues, their voices mingling with the clang of hammers from the foundries. By midday, the air was thick with heat and fragrance. Roasted grain, molten metal, and the faint sweetness of cedar smoke. Nothing stood still. Even the wind seemed to carry the hum of industry. Far beyond its walls, the network of roads widened into arteries of commerce. Bridges spanned the Sangarius, connecting markets and fortresses in every direction. Through those routes flowed the pulse of the realm. Silver from Lydia, amber from the northern coasts, tin from the east. In exchange went the products of Phrygian mastery. Bronze vessels that caught the light like captured flame, dyed fabrics woven with geometric precision, carved furniture smooth as river stone. The merchants of neighboring lands began to measure value by what bore the mark of Gordium. Within the city itself, craftsmanship rose to the level of ceremony. Apprentices trained for years to achieve the stillness of hand, required to carve perfect symmetry. Metalworkers treated their furnaces as altars, murmuring invocations to the mother before pouring molten bronze into molds. To create was to participate in her eternal act of renewal. Every object, from a simple cup to a royal ornament, was a fragment of devotion made tangible. At the city's heart, the royal compound commanded the horizon. Massive beams of pine and oak held roofs layered with copper sheeting that gleamed under both sun and stars. Courtyards opened toward the river winds, carrying cool air and the scent of blossoms from the gardens below. In its grandest hall, murals unfurled the story of the kingdom, the arrival of the first settlers, the rise of the early kings, the peace that followed their struggles. Each scene blended myth and memory so seamlessly that few could tell where history ended and reverence began. High on the ridge above the citadel stood the palace, less fortress than sanctum. Columns of cedar carved with patterns of vines supported a roof painted in deep blue and red. When light poured through its windows, the interior seemed to breathe. From its terraces, the ruler could trace the Sangarius as it coiled through the plains, a silver thread binding the land together. Councils met daily in its halls, debating trade, tribute, and the delicate diplomacy that kept empires at bay. Beyond the city's edge, a vast mound rose against the northern sky. It was neither hill nor temple, but both. The great mound, built to honor the royal lineage. Beneath layers of packed earth and timbered chambers rested offerings too fine for mortal use. Vessels of bronze, furniture inlaid with ivory, textiles dyed in colors that defied fading. Some said the mound guarded the remains of an ancestor. Others whispered it was prepared for the reigning monarch himself. Whatever its purpose, it embodied the Phrygian conviction that splendor should live twice, once above ground, once beneath it. Across the plains, prosperity radiated outward. Villages thrived under noble stewards, their boundaries marked by carved stones and sacred groves. Harvests were steady, and famine seemed a tale from some older, harsher age. Taxes were paid not in fear, but in pride, for to contribute to Gordium's glory was to share in its immortality. Craftsmen and farmers alike felt part of a divine pattern, the belief that order itself was proof of blessing. Music filled the spaces where words could not reach. In the fields, reapers sang verses that echoed the hymns of the temple. In the palace, lyres and flutes wove melodies celebrating the mother's generosity. Poets composed praises, comparing the ruler's reign to the steady light of the sun, bright, constant, and beyond envy. Even the tools of labor carried ornament, a sign that beauty and function were no longer separate things, but partners in the same devotion. Still, peace has a weight of its own. The abundance that united Phrygia also softened its edges. Nobles who once rode to defend the borders now competed for luxury. Merchants accumulated influence that rivaled lineage. Rivalries, muted for generations, began to stir beneath the polished surface of civility. In the capital, ambition found new ways to disguise itself, in patronage, in marriage, in whispered counsel. Beyond Phrygia's frontiers, powers old and new took notice. To the east, Assyria's armies gathered under kings whose cruelty had become legend. Their emissaries arrived at Gordium bearing gifts that were also warnings: carved ivory boxes, gold-inlaid daggers, maps drawn with ominous accuracy. The ruler of Phrygia welcomed them with festivals and diplomacy, matching threat with courtesy, tribute with pride. For a time, this delicate balance held, and peace endured through performance. In the west, Lydia was rising, a younger kingdom shaped by Phrygian influence yet restless for independence. Its kings adopted Phrygian styles of art and ceremony, but their admiration carried the seed of rivalry. The same trade routes that enriched Gordium tempted others to challenge its control. The air of harmony stretched thinner with each passing year. Even as politics grew uncertain, the rituals of faith continued unchanged. Each spring, priests led processions from the city gates toward the hills, carrying statues of the Great Mother draped in garlands. Drums echoed across the valleys, their rhythm merging with the sound of wind in the fields. At the center of it all walked the king, barefoot and robed in white linen, pouring wine upon the earth. His gesture renewed the ancient bond between soil and sovereignty, a reminder that Phrygia's power came not from conquest, but from communion with the land itself. Historical traces speak of yet another reconstruction of the capital during this time. Streets were laid in measured grids, walls reinforced with timber and stone. Engineers sought symmetry even in defense, ensuring that every tower aligned with the next as if responding to invisible geometry. The architecture reflected an optimism bordering on faith, a conviction that beauty could hold chaos at bay. But perfection is a fragile state. As prosperity deepened, so did complacency. The first signs of unease appeared as rumors. Caravans harassed in the east, fortresses razed by raiders no one could name. Messengers reported nomads moving westward across the steppe, swift as wind and merciless as fire. Few believed such tales. No one wanted to imagine that Gordium, so fortified and blessed, could ever fall. At dusk, the city still gleamed as though untouched by time. Travelers approaching from the hills saw the walls burn gold under the setting sun, the illusion of flame repeating night after night. They called it the city that burned without perishing. Inside, the ruler stood on his terrace, gazing toward the horizon, unaware that the omen was already speaking. For in the stillness beneath prosperity, the forces of destruction were gathering. Wealth had made the kingdom visible to every hungry eye, and its splendor, once protection, had become invitation. The hum of the foundries, the laughter of the markets, the chants in the temples, all would soon be interrupted by a new sound, the thunder of hooves. Phrygia had perfected the art of endurance. What it had yet to learn was how quickly eternity can end. Across the mountains, the empire of Assyria was stirring again. After decades of internal strife, its kings had rediscovered ambition and forged it into iron. From their citadels at Nineveh and Calhu, they sent forth armies disciplined as machines, inscribing their triumphs on stone for the gods to witness. When they looked west, they saw the plateau of Phrygia glowing with wealth, and they began to wonder who ruled the golden land beyond the Halys. Word reached Gordium that emissaries were coming. They did not travel in haste. Assyrian diplomacy preferred patience to humility. Long before they arrived, messengers brought tablets covered in the wedge-shaped writing of empire, polite greetings that read like veiled demands. The ruler of Phrygia, known in foreign tongues as Mita of Mushki, understood their meaning perfectly. He had seen how Assyria turned neighbors into vassals and vassals into ruins. Yet he also knew that resistance would invite disaster. When the delegation finally entered Gordium, the city responded with ceremony rather than fear. Drummers announced their arrival, priests lined the roads, and the sovereign himself received them in the palace courtyard. Beneath banners embroidered with the winged sun, he offered gifts of bronze and cedar, symbols of friendship and parity. The Assyrians, accustomed to subservience, found instead a king who spoke to them as an equal. Diplomacy became the kingdom's armor. Phrygia stood too far west for Assyria to conquer easily, yet close enough to command its attention. Between them stretched a frontier of words, letters, treaties, and carefully measured silences. Mita of Mushki played this game with grace, acknowledging the empire's strength without ever admitting subordination. His envoys brought messages wrapped in cloth and sealed with intricate knots, gestures of respect designed to flatter Assyrian pride while concealing independence. Meanwhile, the court of Gordium buzzed with speculation. Scribes recorded each meeting in both tongues, ensuring that posterity would remember Phrygia as the partner of kings, not their servant. Nobles debated whether these distant conquerors could be trusted, while merchants counted the profits that came from peace. The ruler listened more than he spoke, aware that patience often outlasts power. Far to the east, Assyrian scribes chronicled the same exchanges from a different angle. Their tablets tell of a Western monarch named Mita, who defied tribute and allied himself with the restless tribes of Anatolia. Whether this was truth or propaganda, it reveals how formidable the Phrygians had become. They were no longer the quiet artisans of an inland realm, but a force recognized and resented by the masters of Mesopotamia. To balance Assyria's might, the Golden King sought allies among those who also feared the empire's advance. Urartu, to the northeast, fierce and mountainous, offered both friendship and risk. Its kings, proud as any Assyrian, resented foreign dominance but mistrusted every partner. Envoys passed between their courts carrying gifts of gold and polished obsidian, bargaining for protection cloaked as cooperation. These fragile pacts wove a net across Anatolia, one that could restrain a giant or strangle those who spun it. In this climate of caution, Phrygia flourished. Diplomacy opened the same roads that trade had built. Caravans traveled under royal seal, escorted by soldiers wearing embossed cuirasses of bronze and leather. Merchants returned with exotic goods and stranger stories, of palaces where lions guarded the gates, of rivers tamed by canals, of kings who hunted men for sport. To the artisans of Gordium, such tales sounded both wondrous and barbaric. Their own ruler, for all his power, ruled through persuasion, a contrast that gave Phrygia's prosperity a moral glow its neighbors lacked. Still, shadows lengthened. The Assyrian kings grew impatient with alliances that yielded more words than tribute. In the records of Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon, the name Mita of Mushki appears beside accounts of rebellion, sometimes as an enemy, sometimes as a friend, depending on the year and the scribe. The truth may be simpler. Phrygia fought when it must, yielded when it had to, and endured through both. In the borderlands, where empires tested each other, small wars flickered like brush fire. Villages vanished overnight. Fortresses changed hands with the seasons. Phrygian captains, hardened by years of vigilance, learned to read the land like scripture, to fight not for conquest, but for delay. Scouts rode far into the east, watching for the banners of Nineveh that might one day darken the horizon. At home, the ruler grew cautious. He strengthened the city's walls, rebuilt the outer gates, and stockpiled grain within the citadel. These preparations were acts of prudence, not panic. Yet they also marked a shift in mood, the first tremor beneath the glitter of the Golden Age. The palace feasts continued, but laughter rang a little thinner. The songs grew grander, as if volume could drown unease. The priests, ever attuned to signs, began to speak of imbalance. Offerings to the mother increased. Her processions became more elaborate. Drums echoed from dawn until dusk, summoning divine protection through repetition. In the temples, carved into rock, acolytes burned incense thick enough to blur the air, pleading for stability in a world turning unpredictable. The goddess, who had once represented fertility, now became a guardian against fear. Beyond the plateau, Assyria's conquests pressed closer. To the south, the kingdom of Carchemish fell. To the east, Urartu reeled under siege. Refugees trickled into Phrygia, bringing tales of fire and flight. The sovereign listened, knowing that each ruined city shortened the distance between their peril and his peace. Yet he still chose negotiation over war. For every threat that arrived, he sent a gift, not of surrender, but of delay. This balance could not last forever. By the late 8th century, the Assyrian court regarded Phrygia with the suspicion reserved for rivals disguised as allies. In Nineveh's records, one tablet praises Mita of Mushki for friendship. Another, written scarcely a decade later, boasts of his defeat. Historians would puzzle over which was truth and which performance, but both reveal the same tension. A small kingdom holding its ground against an empire that recognized neither equals nor boundaries. Meanwhile, within Gordium's walls, the monarch faced a subtler battle, that of confidence against time. He had built his reign on harmony, yet harmony demands constant maintenance. The nobles who once revered him began to question his caution. Younger officers whispered that glory lay not in peace, but in defiance. His artisans, insulated by success, continued their work as if beauty itself could repel danger. In private moments, the Golden King may have sensed the tide turning. From his terrace, he could see the horizon darken with distant storms. The fields still gleamed, but the winds had changed. Somewhere beyond those mountains, forces were moving, unseen, unheeded, and unstoppable. To the chroniclers of Assyria, Mita of Mushki would remain a footnote, a troublesome monarch briefly illuminated by the empire's torchlight. To his own people, he was still the embodiment of wisdom and endurance. But the time for diplomacy was closing. Even as letters continued to cross the frontier, The real messengers were already on their way, riders who carried not greetings, but fire. The shadows that fell upon Gordium in those years were not yet ruin, but they were the shape of ruin to come. And though the king still ruled with steadiness and faith, the plateau itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that peace was only the silence before thunder. It began not with an army, but with a rumor. Traders returning from the northern routes spoke of riders who moved like storm clouds, silent, swift, and without mercy. They had no cities, no kings, only the momentum of hunger and the promise of plunder. The Assyrians called them Cimmerians. To the people of the plateau, they were a myth until the day smoke appeared on the horizon. For generations, Phrygia had believed itself untouchable. Its borders had held against ambition. Its diplomacy had soothed empires, and its wealth had bought time. But time was the one currency even kings could not hoard. The warnings came too late. Villages along the river vanished overnight. Caravans disappeared without trace. When survivors reached Gordium, they spoke of riders who struck and vanished like wind, their horses black with dust, their arrows leaving silence in their wake. The sovereign called his council at dawn. Scribes recorded his words with shaking hands as he ordered the mustering of every able man. From distant towns, farmers and herders took up bronze spears long idle in the temples. Nobles assembled their retainers, banners fluttering above hastily gathered troops. The old confidence returned for a moment, that if Phrygia could build walls high enough and hearts strong enough, it could outlast any storm. Across the northern plains, scouts lit warning fires. Yet the riders came faster than news could travel. When they reached the first line of watchtowers, they did not pause to conquer. They burned and moved on. Smoke rose in columns that the wind carried toward the capital, so that the people of Gordium saw their own future flickering in the distance. The attack came at twilight. From the walls, sentries watched the plain darken under dust. Then came the sound, not drums, not the organized rhythm of war, but the rolling thunder of hooves without end. By nightfall, the Cimmerians were upon them. Their weapons were crude but swift, their numbers impossible to count. Archers lined the ramparts, loosing volleys into the darkness. Yet for every rider that fell, 10 more appeared. Within hours, the gates were breached. Flames climbed the outer markets first, licking through the stalls where bronze and cedar had been traded for a century. The streets filled with smoke so thick that men fought shadows instead of foes. In the palace, courtiers rushed to save tablets and treasures, while servants carried statues of the gods into the courtyards, pleading for protection that did not come. The drums of the temple drowned beneath the roar of fire. By morning, Gordium was no longer a city, but a pyre. Roofs collapsed inward, beams cracking like thunder. The copper sheathing of the citadel melted and ran down the walls in molten streams. Fields that had fed thousands turned to blackened stubble. Above it all, the great mound loomed untouched. The tomb of kings watching over the ruin of their descendants. Historical traces later revealed what the survivors must have seen. Layers of ash and charcoal, shattered pottery. The outline of timbers turned to ghostly dust. The city had not fallen through siege or betrayal, but through the sheer velocity of destruction. The Cimmerians had no interest in ruling what they burned. They left behind silence, and in it, the echo of a world that had believed itself eternal. The Golden King, Midas to some, Meter of Mushki to others, vanished in that storm. No one agreed on his fate. Some said he died defending the gates, struck down by an arrow before the palace doors. Others whispered that he chose his own end, rather than see the kingdom humiliated. The Greek poets, eager for tragedy, imagined him taking poison after watching his city burn. Whatever truth lies beneath those versions, his disappearance marked more than a death. It was the extinguishing of the age that bore his name. Those who survived fled west, carrying what they could on carts and in memory. They followed the river until they reached the borderlands of Lydia, where new rulers offered safety in exchange for service. Craftsmen were welcomed in foreign courts, their skills too valuable to waste. Soldiers became mercenaries. Priests carried their goddess into exile. Even in dispersion, the Phrygians endured, fragments of a kingdom scattered but unbroken in faith. For years afterward, travelers crossing the plateau spoke of Gordium as a place haunted by fire. The ruins still smoked when the first scavengers arrived, searching for metal among the ashes. Beneath the burned layers, they found chambers collapsed upon themselves, walls fused by heat, and statues melted into formless brilliance. In later generations, the site would be rebuilt, but never again with the confidence of the old days. The new Gordium would be a provincial town, a scar pretending to be a capital. The destruction rippled across Anatolia. Lydia absorbed the refugees. Assyria claimed the narrative. In its archives, scribes recorded that Mita of Mushki had perished. A victory, they said, granted by their gods. But those who remembered him differently spoke of a king, undone not by empire, but by chance. A man who had built perfection, only to watch it prove mortal. Among the refugees, stories began to shift into myth. They said the Great Mother had turned her face away because the land had grown too proud. Others claimed she had hidden her people within the hills, preserving them until humility returned. Each tale softened the sting of reality, transforming disaster into destiny. The Phrygians, once masters of balance, now found meaning in loss. Years later, when the ashes cooled and the grass returned, travelers could still see the outlines of the old city. From a distance, it looked almost whole. The ramparts traced their familiar shape, the gates still visible as mounds of stone. Yet when one walked among them, nothing was left but silence and splinters of bronze. The air itself seemed to carry memory, the faint scent of smoke that no wind could quite erase. The fall of Gordium was more than the end of a kingdom. It was the end of an idea. Phrygia had believed that faith and art could hold back time, that beauty might protect what strength could not. But no melody, no mural, no polished bronze could withstand the blunt truth of motion. The riders from the north had no interest in its gods or its glory. They were not conquerors of nations, but of certainty. When dawn came again over the ruined plateau, the light revealed a world stripped bare. The Cimmerians moved on, leaving behind only embers and silence. From those embers, new powers would one day rise, but none would ever match the poise or grace of the world that perished there. And so, the Age of Gold ended in smoke. The city that had once burned without dying now burned to die. Its walls, its songs, its myths all became part of the same lament, carried on the wind that still whispered through the blackened fields of Phrygia. After the flames, there was quiet, the kind of stillness that follows exhaustion, not peace. The smoke above the plateau thinned, revealing a world of ashes and ghosts. Where Gordium once ruled the horizon, only the great mound stood unscathed. Its shadow stretching across fields turned to cinder. For the survivors, rebuilding was less an act of hope than defiance. They had lost a kingdom, but not the memory of one. The first years after the fall were years of wandering. Families drifted west along the river valleys. seeking safety in lands untouched by the riders. They brought what little they could carry: heirlooms of bronze, fragments of pottery, scraps of woven cloth. When they spoke, it was of what had been: the walls of Gordium, the brightness of its feasts, the sound of hammers in the morning. Those stories became their provisions, sustaining them when the body could not. Having torched what they could not hold, the Cimmerians drifted away, a sickness borne on the wind. In their wake came others, more patient and more calculating. To the west, the kingdom of Lydia began to rise, its rulers claiming descent from ancient Anatolian dynasties. They looked upon the broken heart of Phrygia and saw not ruin, but opportunity. Under the Lydian kings, the survivors found both protection and submission. Garrisons were established on the old roads, and the burned cities were repopulated under new banners. Gordium itself was cleared of rubble, its charred beams replaced by modest timber, its temples rebuilt on smaller foundations. Once the pride of a realm, it became an outpost, a provincial town whose people bowed to foreign governors but still whispered their own prayers. Life under the Lydian shadow was pragmatic, not proud. Tribute replaced taxation, and trade flowed again, though the profits went elsewhere. Markets reopened in the ruins, and merchants once more carried goods along the Sangarius, their voices echoing where shouts of battle had once sounded. Craftsmen returned to their forges, shaping tools and ornaments in the old style. The art that had once adorned palaces now decorated the homes of overseers. Even diminished, the Phrygian hand was unmistakable, precise, rhythmic, and solemn, as if every line carried the weight of remembrance. Language endured longer than sovereignty. Inscriptions continued to appear on stone and pottery, written in the familiar alphabet, though now surrounded by foreign words. The Lydians valued the artisans of Phrygia and often employed them in their own cities. Sardis, Thyatira, Colossae. There, the echoes of Gordium found new homes. The distinctive patterns of Phrygian textiles, the curving lines of its metalwork, and the solemn symmetry of its sculpture began to blend with Lydian taste. Out of defeat came influence, quiet but persistent. Faith, too, refused to vanish. The Great Mother remained where armies could not reach, in the mountains, in the groves, in the secret songs of women. Her worship adapted to the new order, her shrines serving both Lydian nobles and Phrygian peasants. To the conquerors, she was another local goddess, useful for maintaining loyalty. To her true followers, she remained the same enduring force that had survived fire and famine. Through her rites, the broken land retained its soul. In Gordium's reduced court, the descendants of old nobles served as administrators for their new masters. They kept the peace, collected tribute, and ensured that the roads stayed open. Though stripped of titles, they carried themselves with a dignity that hinted at an older, deeper authority. Among themselves, they still spoke of their ancestors as kings and the capital as sacred ground. To outsiders, they appeared subdued. Within, they nurtured the belief that Phrygia was sleeping, not dead. Meanwhile, Lydia prospered. Gold flowed down from Mount Tmolus, and Sardis became a beacon of wealth. Its rulers, Gyges and later Aliates, extended their reach across the western plains, binding lesser realms into their orbit. Yet even as they absorbed Phrygian territory, they adopted Phrygian forms. Their artisans copied the style of Gordium's bronzes. Their temples borrowed the shape of Phrygian sanctuaries. What could not be conquered was imitated. Some scholars of later ages would say that the Phrygians disappeared in these years. But disappearance is a trick of perspective. Beneath the Lydian banners, the people endured in quieter ways. They rebuilt their villages with the same layouts as before, kept the same festivals, and buried their dead beneath small mounds that mimicked the Great Mound itself. Children grew up hearing tales of Midas not as myth, but as memory. The fire that had destroyed their city had not erased their lineage, it had tempered it. From time to time, the land remembered its old defiance. Uprisings flared in the borderlands, not wars of ambition, but of pride. Each was crushed swiftly, yet the pattern revealed something deeper, a refusal to forget. The Lydians might rule in name, but the plateau remained Phrygian in spirit. Even the conquerors' inscriptions, carved to celebrate victory, sometimes used the local tongue, as though acknowledging the endurance of what they had claimed to erase. In the sanctuaries carved into the rock near Midas city, worship continued much as it had before. Offerings of grain and wine still lined the altars, and prayers still rose to the Great Mother whose face was carved into the cliffs. Travelers who came there from the west wrote that the music of her priests, the drums, the pipes, the wild, echoing chants, seemed older than time itself. They were right. Beneath every new layer of rule, Phrygia's faith still beat with its own pulse. By the end of the 7th century, a new empire loomed beyond the eastern mountains. The Persians, once vassals of the Medes, were beginning to stir. In Sardis, Lydian kings fortified their treasury and expanded their armies, uncertain whether their western riches could withstand another rising power. For Phrygia, already accustomed to survival beneath larger shadows, it was only another turn of history's wheel. The plateau had known kings who built with gold and kings who rebuilt from ashes. Now it learned endurance without illusion. Its people ploughed the same soil that had buried their ancestors, drew water from wells dug in older ages, and taught their children to respect both the gods and the ruins that bore their names. They had been conquerors, then conquered, yet through both remained themselves. In time, travelers would stop at Gordium's modest inns and marvel that this quiet town had once been the seat of a kingdom. Locals would nod and smile, saying little. The past was not something they needed to prove. It was in the air they breathed, in the earth beneath their feet. The Lydians might hold the crown, but Phrygia held memory. And memory, as history has often shown, endures longer than gold. By the dawn of the 6th century BC, the plateau had learned the rhythm of subjugation. Empires rose to claim it, ruled for a time, then vanished like storms that left the earth unchanged beneath. After the ashes of the Cimmerian fire and the long years under Lydian watch, Phrygia settled into a quieter existence, neither sovereign nor slave, but something in between. Under the Lydian kings, order returned, though it was an order bought by obedience. The markets reopened in the shadow of foreign banners, and the roads that once led to Gordium now carried tribute towards Sardis. Lydia's rulers understood the value of peace when measured in profit. They taxed the fields, guarded the highways, and demanded loyalty in exchange for stability. The Phrygians complied, not from fear, but from the memory of what chaos had cost them. Sardis shone like a new sun in the west. Its temples glittered with gold drawn from the sands of Mount Tmolus, and its treasury overflowed with the wealth of 100 provinces. Within its walls, the first stamped coins appeared, small discs of electrum bearing the image of the lion and bull, symbols of strength and balance. When those coins reached Gordium, they seemed to carry both fortune and warning. Metal could bind nations together, but it could also measure their submission. The people of the plateau adapted. Farmers tended their fields under the watch of Lydian overseers. Merchants traded in the same markets their ancestors had built. and craftsmen continued to shape bronze and wood with the precision that had once made their name famous. Though their products now bore foreign seals, their style remained unmistakably Phrygian, austere, symmetrical, proud. It was a quiet act of endurance, art as identity. In the sanctuaries of the Mother, worship continued much as before. Her image, carved into cliff and rock, watched over the valleys where her people worked. The Lydians called her by new names and added her to their pantheon, yet the old hymns persisted. Pilgrims still journeyed to her shrines, leaving offerings of fruit, wine, and small bronze figures in her likeness. If empires claimed the land, she claimed its heart. Change came from the east once more. The Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, rose against their Median masters and swept westward in a campaign that turned kingdoms into provinces. Sardis, rich and overconfident, fell to them in 546 BC after a brief siege. Lydia vanished almost overnight, its gold seized, its gods unconsulted. For Phrygia, there was no war, only a change in messengers and the language of decrees. Under the Persians, life regained stability, though of a different kind. The conquerors divided their vast realm into satrapies, each governed by a local administrator responsible for tribute and peace. Phrygia became one such province, its capital rebuilt, its boundaries defined. The satrap stationed at Gordium ruled in the name of the great king, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, and reporting on unrest. To most, the empire's rule felt distant, a presence sensed rather than seen. For the first time in centuries, the plateau experienced sustained calm. Persian policy, pragmatic and tolerant, allowed old customs to persist. The Phrygian tongue continued to be spoken in villages. Temples still honored local gods beside those of Persia. The mother of the mountain, now equated with the eastern goddess Anahita, received offerings alongside the fires sacred to Ahura Mazda. The fusion of faiths was less conquest than conversation. Trade flourished under imperial protection. The royal road, stretching from Sardis to Susa, cut directly across Phrygia. Along it passed envoys, soldiers, and merchants bearing goods from 3 continents, silks from the east, silver from the Aegean, spices from Arabia. Caravans stopped at Gordium, now a provincial capital lined with way stations and inns. The city once again found itself at the crossroads of empire, thriving not by power, but by proximity. To the villagers who watched these processions, it must have seemed as though history had looped upon itself. Once more, they lived between mighty neighbors, speaking the language of one and praying in the tongue of another. Yet in that liminal space lay survival. The Phrygians had mastered the art of adaptation, bending to each new master without breaking. From time to time, rebellion flared elsewhere in the empire. Egypt in revolt, Ionia in flames, Babylon restless under Persian rule. But the plateau remained quiet. The people who had seen empires burn understood the futility of defiance. Instead, they offered the great king what he valued most: order. In return, they received roads that did not crumble, trade that did not falter, and peace that lasted longer than memory. Still, even in peace, the past endured. Beneath Gordium's rebuilt streets lay layers of its former selves. The burnt city of Midas, the earlier strongholds of forgotten kings. Children played among fragments of stone, inscribed in languages no one read anymore. To them, those ruins were part of the landscape, as inevitable as the hills. Each generation built upon the last, as if refusing to let the dead sink completely into silence. In distant Persepolis, Persian kings carved reliefs of their subjects bringing tribute. Medes, Egyptians, Indians, and among them, figures in pointed caps and patterned cloaks, the Phrygians. They are shown offering textiles and finely worked metal bowls, their posture proud despite their submission. The image captures the paradox of the age, a people conquered yet never erased. Faith bound them more securely than any empire could. The mother remained their constant companion, her cult spreading along the trade routes that connected east and west. Pilgrims carried her worship into foreign lands, and foreign lands, in turn, carried it home transformed. By the 5th century, her rites had reached the Aegean and begun to mingle with Greek beliefs. To outsiders, she was a curiosity. To her people, she was continuity itself. In the evenings, when the caravans had settled and the city lay quiet, Gordium must have seemed almost content. The scent of cooking fires drifted through narrow streets. Traders haggled over the day's last bargains. Priests offered small libations at roadside shrines. No one spoke of kings anymore, only of overseers and gods. After centuries of turmoil, peace, even borrowed peace, felt like a miracle. But the plateau was not done teaching impermanence. Beyond the empire's borders, the Greeks were rising, restless, inventive, and soon to challenge Persia itself. For now, the echoes of that coming storm had not reached the heartland. The people of Phrygia went on sowing, trading, worshipping, and remembering as they had always done. They had learned that survival could be its own form of victory. Kingdoms fell, empires changed, gods traded names. Yet through it all, the rhythm of their lives endured. Between Lydia and Persia, between past and future, they had found a balance more enduring than any crown, the quiet strength of continuity. Before Phrygia had kings or coins or fortresses, it had a mountain. And upon that mountain, carved into the living rock, the image of a woman stared across the plains, arms open, eyes unblinking, her face both human and divine. She was Matar, the mother, the heart that beat beneath the stones of Anatolia. Through centuries of conquest, her presence never dimmed. When borders shifted and empires rose, she remained where they could not reach, in the hills, in the wind, in the unbroken silence between harvests. Her worship was older than language, older than Gordium itself. In the beginning, she was simply the earth, patient, fertile, and implacable. To the farmers who coaxed grain from the soil, she was provider. To the rulers who built on that soil, she was guarantor. When the people prayed for rain, they turned not toward the sky, but toward the cliffs that held her likeness. To them, the mountain was not stone, but body, and every tremor, every bloom of spring was her response. Even after the Cimmerians' fire and the Lydian occupation, her sanctuaries endured. The temples built in her honor were never grand in the way of Eastern ziggurats or Greek marble shrines. They were carved straight into the land, facades etched with rosettes, lions, and geometric patterns that mimicked the perfection of nature itself. Among these, the rock monument at Midas city stood supreme, a vast sculpted altar whose front bore the inscription of her name. When dawn touched it, the stone seemed to ignite, as if the mother were reclaiming the light she had lent to the sun. To approach her was not to enter, but to ascend. Pilgrims climbed the slopes barefoot, singing hymns that mingled prayer with lament. The air was filled with the scent of pine and burning oil, the sound of cymbals and reed pipes rising in waves. At the summit, priests poured wine into fissures in the rock, returning to the earth what had been taken from it. Each offering was a conversation, a cycle completed, giving and receiving in equal measure. Her rites were both beautiful and unsettling. Unlike the structured rituals of foreign gods, Hers were ecstatic, meant to dissolve the boundaries between mortal and divine. Devotees danced until their bodies trembled. Drummers beat a rhythm, said to echo the pulse of the world itself. In time, her priesthood grew distinct. Men who, in acts of devotion, renounced their former selves, adopting the dress and voice of the goddess they served. To outsiders, it seemed madness. To her followers, it was transformation. The mother demanded nothing less than total surrender. Under Persian rule, her worship not only survived, but flourished. The empire's tolerance of local faiths allowed her cult to expand, weaving itself into the fabric of everyday life. Merchants invoked her before journeys. Farmers offered her the first fruits of harvest. Even the satraps stationed in Gordium learned to respect her name. For her favor, it was said, could calm the earth or call it to vengeance. As Phrygian craftsmen traveled across the empire, they carried her image with them. Her likeness appeared on small terracotta figurines, found as far east as Susa and as far west as the Aegean coast. Each figure bore the same symbols: the mural crown, the lions at her side, and the unyielding gaze. The Greeks who encountered her called her Cybele in later speech, and in time adopted her into their own pantheon. Yet even as she became a goddess of other tongues, her essence remained Phrygian, wild, maternal, and free. In her Greek form, Cybele was both familiar and foreign, a reminder of the East's mystery to the rational West. Her rites shocked the philosophers of Athens, who watched her priests with both fascination and disdain. To them, her music and frenzy were relics of a primitive age, but the Greeks also understood her appeal. In her chaos, they sensed truth, that creation and destruction are one rhythm, that life requires surrender. Back in Phrygia, her mountain shrines remained alive with devotion. The faithful gathered during planting and harvest, their festivals timed to the cycles of the moon. Women carried torches through the fields at night, singing songs of fertility and mourning in equal measure. Each note was both celebration and remembrance, for their goddess had endured the fall of kingdoms, and in her endurance lay their own. In the towns that dotted the plateau, her temples became places of refuge. The poor sought her blessing, the sick her mercy, the weary her understanding. Her priests dispensed healing herbs and oracles alike, reading omens in fire and grain. Even those who worshipped other gods still invoked her when the earth shook or the rains failed. To curse the mother was to curse the land itself. Her mythology deepened with time. New stories joined the old, of her companion Attis, the shepherd who died and was reborn, symbol of the vegetation that perished each winter, only to rise again in spring. The tale, woven from grief and renewal, captured the heart of her faith, that life feeds upon death, that even decay has purpose. In the songs sung at her festivals, the name of Attis mingled with hers, the refrain of birth and rebirth echoing across the hills. Among foreign merchants, the cult's reputation spread like rumor. Some came to witness the ceremonies for curiosity's sake and left shaken. Others returned home bearing small tokens, a figurine, a carved stone, a story they could not forget. Through them, the mother began her long migration westward. Her worship crossed seas, entered islands, and found new homes in Greece, then Rome. Each place remade her in its image. Yet the rhythm of the drums, the cry of the pipes, and the ecstasy of her rites remained true to the plateau that first called her name. For the Phrygians who stayed behind, this transformation was both pride and sorrow. They had given the world a goddess, but the world did not know her as they did. To them, she was not merely the Great Mother, she was memory itself, the last remnant of their lost kingdom turned divine. When travelers approached Midas city in those years, they wrote of the strange quiet that surrounded it. The wind moved through the pines like breath, and the carved face of the goddess seemed almost alive in the changing light. Offerings of wine and flowers still lined the base of the monument. Even centuries after the fall of Gordium, someone always came to speak her name. By the time Alexander's armies would march through the land, the mother had already outlived every dynasty that had claimed her. Her faith had become the thread connecting all that Phrygia had been. The farmers, the artisans, the kings, and the exiles. She had no need of empire or scripture. Her temple was the mountain. Her altar, the earth itself. Long after the last Phrygian throne turned to dust, the goddess remained. The drums still beat in her honor, echoing across valleys once ruled by men. For all their wars and treaties, no empire ever conquered her. She was, and would always be, the enduring heart of the land, the mountain that remembers. When the armies of Alexander the Great crossed into Asia, they found a land already thick with memory. Cities lay in layers, Lydian above Phrygian, Phrygian above Hittite, and every hill seemed to whisper of forgotten gods. Among those ancient places stood Gordium, once a capital, now a quiet town on the old royal road. Its fields still yielded grain, its river still bent toward the Sangarius, but its glory had long turned to legend. Only one thing kept it alive in the imagination of men: a cart tied to a post with a knot no one could untie. The tale had endured through centuries of retelling. Some said it was the very cart of the farmer king who first ruled the land, left in the temple of the storm god as a symbol of his destiny. Others believed it was a sacred relic, its tangled cord a riddle the gods had set for humankind. Whoever could loosen it, the prophecy declared, would rule all Asia. For generations, kings, priests, and wanderers had tried and failed. The knot endured, its coils growing brittle with age yet unbroken in defiance. When Alexander arrived, he was only 22, newly crowned and impatient with the weight of omens. He had already crossed the Hellespont as conqueror of the Greeks, heir to Achilles, pupil of Aristotle, and a man convinced that fortune obeyed the bold. His army marched through Phrygia, not for plunder, but for passage, a river of soldiers flowing toward the Persian heartland. Yet when he reached Gordium, the legend intercepted him like a challenge. The city greeted him with wary curiosity. Its people had seen empires come and go. This new invader was only another name on the wind. Still, they welcomed him as custom demanded, offering bread, wine, and the old stories that had once bound their ancestors. They led him to the ancient citadel, now half ruin and half shrine, and there, within a temple dark with incense, stood the fabled cart. Its yoke was fastened by cords of cornel bark, hardened by time into a single mass. No end could be found, no beginning either. It was a puzzle of patience and fate. Alexander examined it in silence while his officers murmured behind him. The air smelled of dust and oil, the faint breath of centuries. For a while, he traced the knot's curves with his hand, as though reading the language of destiny written in rope. Then, with the same suddenness that had marked every decision of his short life, he drew his sword and struck. The blade flashed once. The cords fell apart. To those who watched, the gesture was both sacrilege and revelation. Some claimed he had cheated the prophecy. Others swore he had fulfilled it. Alexander himself dismissed the distinction. "It makes no difference how the knot is undone," he is said to have remarked, "so long as it no longer binds." The simplicity of the act stunned those who had spent lifetimes pondering what he resolved in a heartbeat. That night, a storm broke over the plains, lightning splitting the horizon. To the soldiers, it seemed an omen, Zeus confirming what man had dared. In the morning, the camp found the ground wet with rain and the air sharp with renewal. The story of the sword and the knot spread faster than his armies. Within months, it was legend. Within years, scripture. For the people of Phrygia, the event carried mixed meaning. The cart had stood as a relic of their first kings, a link to a past that even the Persians had respected. Now it lay severed, its cords cut by a foreign conqueror who claimed destiny in their stead. Some saw liberation in the gesture, others violation. The act that freed the knot also closed the circle of Phrygian sovereignty. What had begun in prophecy ended in symbol. Alexander lingered in the city for several days, reorganizing its governance and paying homage at its shrines. He ordered sacrifices to the local gods, as he did everywhere he went, ensuring favor through respect. The priests of the Mother welcomed him with cautious courtesy, sensing in his ambition a reflection of her creative destruction. They showed him the great mound of the old kings, now weathered and silent, and he, ever drawn to glory's remnants, listened to their stories. Perhaps he understood that every empire is only the echo of one before it. After his departure, Gordium changed once again. The Macedonians left a garrison in its citadel and turned it into a supply base for the march eastward. Soldiers repaired its roads, fortified its walls, and filled its empty houses with the voices of strangers. The quiet market town became a station of empire, the pulse of conquest passing through its heart like a drumbeat. In the wake of his sword stroke, even the ruins took on new meaning. The knot became a metaphor for Alexander himself, audacious, impatient, unstoppable. Philosophers debated its lesson, poets turned it into parable. Was it wisdom to cut what one could not untie, or arrogance? Was the act a triumph over destiny, or proof that destiny had chosen him all along? The Phrygians, who had lived too long with prophecy, understood better than most that such questions have no answers. Still, they watched with fascination as his legend unfolded. News of his victories reached them in waves: Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, names that spread like thunder across the world. To the older generation, he was the heir of those who once burned their cities. To the younger, he was the measure of possibility itself. The plateau had always given birth to stories, and now it had become one. By the time the Macedonian armies moved on, Phrygia was no longer a kingdom, nor even a province of Persia, but a corridor of empire, a land that had surrendered its history to a single act of gesture and blade. Yet that gesture ensured its immortality. For centuries to come, travelers would climb the hill at Gordium and stand before the pedestal where the knot had once hung. They would look upon the empty post and see not absence but transformation, a place where legend and history had met, and neither had survived unchanged. In the silence that followed, Gordium slipped once more into stillness. The garrison departed, the roads emptied, and the wind reclaimed the fields. But in the echo of that sword stroke, the spirit of Phrygia lingered. Its people, long accustomed to endurance, understood what Alexander perhaps never did, that to cut a knot is to end one's story, but not to stop the weaving of others. When Alexander's brilliant blaze at last burned out, the world he had forged fractured into pieces. From the Nile to the Indus, generals who had once called him Lord now called themselves kings. On maps that changed with every campaign, Phrygia was passed from one conqueror to another, like a prize too valuable to ignore and too troublesome to keep. The plateau had known many masters before, but never such a succession of them. Macedonian, Seleucid, Galatian, Attalid, each speaking a new tongue, each claiming to bring order, each vanishing in time. For a while, Gordium remained under Macedonian control, its garrisoned walls echoing with foreign commands. Soldiers from distant lands filled its streets, mixing with merchants who had long ago learned the art of surviving under any flag. The old Phrygian tongue still lingered in the villages, but in the cities, Greek words now carried the weight of authority. What began as the language of soldiers soon became that of trade, then of art, then of thought itself. The Seleucid dynasty, heirs to Alexander's Eastern Empire, ruled the region for generations with the calculated patience of administrators rather than the passion of conquerors. They rebuilt roads, established colonies, and brought Greek artisans to settle beside local craftsmen. In their cities, colonnades replaced mud brick walls. Statues of Apollo and Athena stood beside the shrines of the mother. Yet the changes were less destruction than layering. The old world not erased, but absorbed. Beneath every marble temple lay the soil of Phrygia, and beneath that, the bones of older kings. Trade flourished again under this new order. Greek merchants brought amphorae of wine and olive oil from the Aegean coast. Caravans from the east arrived laden with spices, silk, and carved ivory. The royal road thrummed once more with the movement of people and goods. Gordium, though diminished, became a stop for travellers rather than a seat of power. Its inns filled with sailors, philosophers, and soldiers of fortune, all speaking in the mixed dialects of empire. In the countryside, however, the rhythm of Phrygian life changed little. Farmers still ploughed the same furrows their ancestors had cut. Shepherds still led their flocks through the high meadows, where the wind carried the same songs. Their gods had new names, but their devotion had not changed. The Great Mother, now called Cybele, by Greeks and Romans alike, continued to reign from her mountain sanctuaries. Her priests still played their drums and pipes. Her devotees still danced until they trembled with ecstasy. The newcomers might have renamed her, but they could not unmake her. Art, too, bore witness to this fusion. Greek sculptors introduced realism and grace. Local craftsmen added pattern and precision. The result was something neither wholly Hellenic nor wholly Phrygian. Elegant forms etched with geometric logic, statues whose faces bore both serenity and gravity. In those hybrid figures, one could read the story of the land itself, a civilization that had survived conquest not by resistance but by transformation. The political landscape, however, was less harmonious. The Seleucid kings, overextended and beset by rivals, struggled to hold their empire together. From the north came the Galatians, tribes of Celtic origin who had wandered into Asia Minor and carved out their own dominions. For decades, the plateau became their battlefield. Villages changed allegiance with the seasons, their inhabitants learning once again to navigate survival amid instability. Yet even as power fractured, the culture deepened. In cities like Apamea, Synoda, and Laodicea, Greek theatres rose beside ancient sanctuaries. Gymnasia taught rhetoric and philosophy to the sons of local nobles. The Phrygian elite, eager to thrive in the new order, sent their children to learn the language of Homer and the politics of Athens. Over time, a new identity emerged, part Anatolian, part Hellenic, a synthesis rather than surrender. By the 2nd century BC, the Attalids of Pergamon had become the latest inheritors of Alexander's legacy in Western Asia Minor. Their rule brought stability and splendor. Pergamon's libraries rivaled those of Alexandria. Its sculptors crafted masterpieces that defined the art of the age. In their shadow, Phrygia enjoyed a prosperity reminiscent of its ancient heights, though without the same unity of spirit. The Attalids respected the region's traditions, restoring temples and supporting local festivals. In Gordium, they even funded repairs to the old fortifications, though the city now served more as symbol than stronghold. Greek historians visiting the plateau during this time described its people as gentle, industrious, and strangely devoted to memory. They noted that even the poorest villagers could recite tales of their distant kings and the burning of Gordium. For the Hellenes, obsessed with lineage and myth, Phrygia was both familiar and exotic, a place where history and legend still walked side by side. Meanwhile, the cult of Cybele, born from those same mountains, began its ascent toward universality. Her worship spread across the Aegean, her temples rising in Athens, Corinth, and eventually Rome. To the Greeks, she was the mother of the gods. To her native land, she remained the mountain itself. Each new devotee extended Phrygia's legacy farther, turning a local goddess into one of the ancient world's most enduring symbols. The spread of her faith mirrored the fate of her people. Both had lost their homeland only to gain the world. The Phrygians, who once tilled these fields, now served as traders, priests, and artisans from Egypt to the Black Sea. They blended so thoroughly into the empires around them that they ceased to be seen as a distinct nation. Yet traces of their spirit lingered in every pattern, every melody, every carved stone that echoed their style. As Pergamon grew wealthy under Attalid rule, the plateau finally exhaled. Roads were safe, taxes predictable, and the drums of the mothers' festivals sounded without fear of interruption. To travelers passing through, Phrygia seemed timeless again, but time, as always, was only pausing. Beyond the horizon, Rome was rising, its appetite boundless, its order absolute. The age of marble kings was nearing its end, and with it, the last chapter of Hellenistic Phrygia. At sunset, from the hills above Gordium, the view remained unchanged. The river winding through the plain, the great mound casting its long shadow, the mountains glowing red with the day's final light. Beneath that surface, calm lay centuries of survival. Kingdoms fallen, gods renamed, languages forgotten. Yet something in the land endured, quiet and unyielding, as if waiting for history's next master to arrive and discover, once again, that conquest is only another layer upon memory. When the last Attalid king of Pergamon willed his realm to Rome, the people of Phrygia scarcely noticed. Empires to them had become seasons, one fading into the next, each promising order, each leaving its own ruins behind. The new conquerors arrived not as destroyers, but as accountants. They took inventory of the world, and Phrygia, patient as ever, simply folded itself into their ledgers. At first, Rome governed from a distance. Governors in Pergamon and Laodicea oversaw taxation, while local councils handled the rhythms of daily life. The legions passed through rarely, their iron sandals striking the same stones once trodden by Assyrian messengers and Persian couriers. What the Romans wanted was stability, and in that the plateau excelled. The land had long ago learned how to endure. Under their administration, new cities bloomed. Laodicea on the Lycus, Hierapolis by its steaming springs, Colossae along the trade routes of the Meander Valley. These were not the earthy towns of Phrygia's ancient kings, but polished marvels of marble and geometry. Colonnaded streets ran arrow straight toward glittering forums. Aqueducts carried water from the hills to fountains where children played beneath statues of emperors. In theatres carved into the slopes, Greek dramas mingled with Roman spectacles. The same amphitheatre that echoed with poetry by day might, by night, resound with the roar of beasts. Trade, once again, was the region's lifeblood. Caravans from the eastern provinces brought silk, frankincense, and gemstones. From the Aegean came wine, olive oil, and the hum of new philosophies. The roads that bound the empire together met in Phrygia, like threads converging in a loom. Along them rode tax collectors, merchants, and priests, each bearing a version of faith or fortune. Through all these changes, the old gods endured. The mother of the mountain, Cybele to the Greeks, Magna Mater to the Romans, remained the soul of the land. Her temples, now rebuilt in marble, crowned the hills above the cities. During her festivals, drums and cymbals still filled the air, joined now by the measured chant of Latin prayers. Roman officers offered sacrifices beside Phrygian peasants, each invoking the same goddess in a different tongue. Her image, borne on carts drawn by lions, moved through the streets to the applause of crowds who no longer remembered she had once belonged solely to them. In the countryside, rural shrines clung to older customs. There, worship remained untamed. The ecstatic rites that had shocked Greek philosophers and fascinated Roman travelers persisted in caves and groves. Pilgrims left offerings of flowers, milk, and honey. Women danced barefoot on the soil, their hair unbound, their songs filled with longing and gratitude. To witness such scenes was to glimpse the deep continuity that connected Phrygia's distant past to its living present. The Romans admired this devotion, even as they absorbed it. They built temples to Cybele in Rome itself, proclaiming her a guardian of empire. But the Phrygians knew better. The goddess was no servant of rulers. She belonged to the earth and to those who listened when it spoke. In her unbroken worship, they found a quiet form of resistance, a reminder that not all authority came from law or sword. Under Roman peace, prosperity deepened. The cities grew wealthy on trade and textiles. Phrygian wool, famous for its softness, clothed patricians from Spain to Syria. Artisans carved marble into sarcophagi, adorned with intricate reliefs. Scenes of gods and heroes entwined with vines. The Phrygian knack for pattern, once confined to bronze and pottery, now found its expression in architecture and mosaic. Floors of villas gleamed with images of Dionysus, Aphrodite, and the Great Mother, different names for the same old powers. Education flourished as well. Greek remained the language of learning, Latin the tongue of administration, and the local speech lingered stubbornly in the villages. Philosophers from Apamea and Synada debated Stoic reason and Platonic idealism beneath porticos, where their ancestors might once have read omens in the flight of birds. Libraries filled with papyrus scrolls, and scholars copied the works of poets who had never seen their land but wrote of it as a place of mystery. Still, the land had not lost its edge of superstition. Travelers told stories of sacred springs that healed or cursed, of caves where strange lights flickered at night. In Hierapolis, the ground steamed with sulfur and hissed with unseen vapors. Locals said it was the breath of Pluto himself, gateway to the underworld. Priests built a temple over the fissure and charged pilgrims to approach it, a theatrical mingling of faith and commerce that suited the age. Amid this richness, new whispers began to spread, of a single god, unseen and uncarved, who favored the humble over the mighty. Traders from Syria carried these teachings westward. Jewish communities along the Meander nurtured them. In the cities of Phrygia, where faith had always been fertile, the message found soil ready to receive it. The first small gatherings met in private homes, sharing bread, wine, and hope. No one yet called them Christians, but their prayers already sounded unlike any heard before. To the authorities, such sects were harmless at first. Rome had room for 1,000 gods. One more seemed trivial. Yet the faith grew quietly, threading itself through households and markets. The same people who had once knelt before Cybele now found comfort in the story of a son who suffered, died, and returned. Another echo of the ancient rhythm of death and rebirth. The new religion borrowed the language of the old, without realizing how deeply that language belonged to the land. By the 2nd century, Phrygia's cities gleamed with prosperity and pride. Travelers from Italy marveled at their baths and theaters, their mosaics and colonnades. But beneath the surface, the ground of belief was shifting. Old sanctuaries emptied, new gatherings formed. The Great Mother's priests still beat their drums, but the sound now mingled with hymns rising from hidden rooms. Two faiths coexisted uneasily, one born of the mountain's silence, the other of the promise of salvation. And still the land remained itself. Mountains crowned with temples, valleys cradling towns, rivers glinting like veins of metal beneath the sun. Rome would call it a province, poets would call it a mystery. To those who lived there, it was simply home, the enduring heart of Anatolia, where empires passed like seasons and faiths like storms. But the soil remembered every name. By the time the empire turned eastward and called itself Byzantine, the land that had once been Phrygia no longer needed a name. It existed as memory, a region folded into others, a word on a map rather than a kingdom of men. Yet beneath the surface of that forgetting, life continued as it always had. Farmers tending fields that fed distant cities, shepherds watching the same constellations their ancestors had sung to, and priests, first pagan, then Christian, walking the same paths between the hills and the heavens. The old faiths lingered longer here than in most of the Roman world. In the remote villages scattered between Gordium, Laodicea, and Hierapolis, people still left offerings at the mouths of caves, still poured wine upon the soil at harvest. The mother had retreated from her temples into the landscape itself. Her name was whispered only in moments of need, during childbirth, during drought, as though the goddess had become a spirit of memory rather than of rule. Her carved face still gazed out from the cliffs of Midas city, weathered and half hidden by ivy, a relic that refused to die. Meanwhile, a new faith took root in the cities. Its followers gathered quietly at first, in homes or abandoned shrines. They spoke of one God, unseen and universal, who offered salvation not through ritual, but through belief. Their hymns borrowed the language of older songs, light born from darkness, life from death, ideas that had lived in this land for millennia. In their prayers, the story of the crucified and risen Son met the ancient rhythm of the dying and reborn God. Perhaps it was this familiarity that made conversion so swift. By the 4th century, Phrygia had become a cradle of early Christianity. Bishops from its towns traveled to the great councils of the empire. Monks established hermitages in its caves and on its mountains. Some were ascetics who renounced the world entirely, living on berries and prayer, their voices echoing across the valleys where the mother had once been praised with drums. Others founded communities devoted to study and compassion, blending Greek philosophy with the discipline of scripture. The land that had birthed one of humanity's oldest religions now offered sanctuary to one of its newest. Conversion, however, was never simple. For generations, pagan and Christian lived side by side. Festivals of the Mother turned into feasts of Mary. Mountain altars became chapels. Priests of the old faith quietly joined the new, carrying with them the gestures and chants of their past. even as crosses rose above the hills. The earth beneath them still held the bones of those who had danced in the goddess's honor. In Hierapolis, the old temple of Cybele became a church dedicated to the Apostle Philip, said to have been martyred there. Pilgrims arrived from across the empire, seeking healing in its springs and salvation in its relics. The city's terraces, once filled with marble sanctuaries, now gleamed with baptistries and basilicas. Yet to the locals, the transformation felt less like destruction than evolution. One form of devotion replacing another, both reaching for the same divine comfort. As the empire fractured, faith became the one language that survived every conquest. When the Goths came, they burned towns but spared the churches. When the Persians raided the borderlands, monks hid manuscripts in caves that had once held idols. Even the great earthquake that struck the region in the 5th century could not erase what centuries of conquest had failed to do. The people rebuilt, as they always had, stone by stone, prayer by prayer. By then, the Phrygian tongue had long vanished from speech, replaced by Greek and Latin. But the accent of the land remained, a softness of vowels, a cadence in song. Travelers from Constantinople remarked that the peasants of the interior sang their psalms with an unfamiliar melody, one that rose and fell like the wind over open fields. It was, perhaps, the last echo of the old hymns, reshaped but not silenced. The Great Mother herself had not entirely disappeared. The Church did what conquerors never could. It adopted her. Her image softened into that of Mary, Mother of Christ, protector of humankind. The mountain temples were rededicated, their idols replaced by icons. Yet even the bishops who blessed them admitted that the devotion felt older than the faith that claimed it. The people still brought her offerings of flowers, still lit candles at her feet, still believed that the earth beneath her image listened. In Gordium, a modest church rose near the ruins of the palace mound. Pilgrims stopped to pray where, they were told, the Golden King had once walked. To them, he was no longer the proud monarch of legend, but a cautionary figure, a man who had trusted in his own glory rather than in grace. His story, retold in sermons, became parable. The ruler who had turned all to gold and lost his soul in the process. The past, once worshipped, had been moralized. By the late 5th century, Phrygia was a land of monasteries and memories. Vineyards surrounded the old tumuli. Olive groves crept up the hills where fortresses had once stood. Pilgrims followed roads laid down in the time of the Persians, passing ruins whose names they no longer knew. At night, they camped beneath the stars, hearing the wind move through the fields like the sigh of an ancient goddess half asleep. No empire lasts forever, but landscapes do. The mountains still held their shape, the rivers their courses, the plains their quiet fertility. Beneath every church lay the stones of a temple, beneath every prayer, a whisper of an older one. History had not erased Phrygia. It had buried it gently, the way soil covers seed. In the centuries that followed, the world would forget the kingdom's name, yet its spirit would remain in the faith, art, and music of those who inherited its land. The mother's face, softened into the virgin's, still gazed from the walls of Byzantine chapels. The language of the earth still lived in the chants of monks. Even the pattern of the fields, drawn by ancient ploughs, survived into new ages. And so Phrygia passed into legend, not vanished, only transformed. It had been many things: a kingdom of artisans, a province of empires, a cradle of gods and saints. Now it was all of them at once, its memory woven into the tapestry of the world. The wind that swept across its plains carried the voices of all who had lived there, From the kings who prayed to the storm, to the monks who whispered psalms to the dawn, time moves on, but the land remembers. In the silence between its mountains, one can still almost hear the echo of drums beneath the ringing of church bells, the sound of a people who learned, across millennia, that faith outlives every empire.